Right, well, I'm going to carry on, and I should say good morning, and I'm very pleased to have been invited this morning. Like Ken, I should perhaps also explain a little bit more about me. I do deal in a lot of social policy. I'm part of the Faculty of Health and Social Care at the Open University, but I'm actually a social gerontologist. So I work with older people in their different environments, predominantly, I would say, internal, their own housing and accommodation and care settings. So those are primarily my focus at the moment. But as Marion said a long time ago, I was a human geographer, and public space in terms of my own research work was very essential in relation to how older people use space. So I'm also going to apologise for the lack of pictures with this presentation, which I am sorry for, but I came back from America yesterday morning, and I'm afraid the transference of photographs from Milton Keynes didn't arrive with me, so I hope you'll bear with me. And certainly, as I say, I have one copy of our JRF report with me, and I hope people will have a look at that later. But anyway, let me get on with this presentation. I also just wanted to acknowledge my colleagues who are part of the project that I'm talking about: Andrew Clark, Caroline Holland and Jeanne Katz, now mixed between the OU and Leeds. And my starting point for this talk is the fact that we live in an ageing society, which you'll all know, but maybe you won't know perhaps too much about the facts of that ageing society, which I see as essential to our discussion of urban planning, and certainly central to what I want to say this morning. Here are just a few facts to contextualize what I want to say, just to demonstrate the way in which we are growing older as a population, and not just in the UK, but certainly throughout Europe, and if not across this is a global phenomenon too. So as you'll see here, this is data from 2006, showing how those over 65 years of age are now forming 1 in 6 of our population, and in particular with the largest percentage of growth amongst people in their over 80s, and particularly over 85, due, as you all know, to improving life expectancy and decreasing mortality. And I should say that I wanted to say a little bit here about the consequences of us having an aging population. I didn't want to go into the health needs of older people too much, but I feel that there are important things to say here, particularly around issues to do with mobility. So we find that particularly amongst our population in their late 70s and on into their 80s, a small proportion of those folk will have mobility problems. So there are issues about walking on our streets and being a part of those communities that we've been talking about. It's also true that Alzheimer's disease, dementia, is the big problem in terms of impairment for older people, especially at advanced age, with 1 in 5 people over the 80s now suffering from some form of Alzheimer's disease. Now, I raise that because some of you may know about the fact that people suffering from Alzheimer's disease may have problems with their memory, may have problems with finding their way around, may have a difficulty that can be helped through things like signage, through things like wayfinding, through things like surfaces under people's feet that are easy to negotiate. So I just raised some of those things now to show that obviously there are across the life course issues for people with different levels of disability. But I want to raise this point in relation to our aging population. At the same time, I wanted to look at this balance that we have here, because you will have seen that the 1 in 6 of the population being over 60, 65, mid-2006. At the same point, we've got 1 in 5 people in the UK aged under 16. So we've got quite a fair balance there at the moment. We'll go on to the future in a moment, where it does become more of an aging population. But this is just to show how actually that the younger population is declining, in a sense. So you've got census data figures here showing that in 1971, 26% were under 16. Mid-2006, that's gone down to 19%. So at the moment, there's been this kind of balancing of both ends of the demography and with the larger group of the working age population. But those figures are changing, and just to bring us right up to date, to show that certainly population aging will continue very much during the first half of the 21st century, and European data showing us that by 2015 our average age will have reached 50 years in Western Europe, and an estimate for 2050 of 29.9% of the European population being over the age of 65, with the proportion of the oldest around 13%. And the other thing I should add here, because it comes up in studies all the time when you observe people within spaces, is there's still a greater life expectancy for women than men at the moment, of around 6 years from birth. And so when you look at the community and observe older people in spaces, they're more likely to be older women in their 70s and 80s than they are older men. It's an interesting statistic, but it does have, it can have issues for how people use space in different ways. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about this project that Ken mentioned, which we for shorthand called the Aylesbury project, because that's where it's centered. And this was really a case study that was carried out for a year on the market town of Aylesbury, which is obviously in southeast England, with a population of 69,000. And our aims in the study were very much, as we've mentioned already, to look at how people use public spaces, and in particular our focus and our areas of interest were around variation in social interaction by age and gender or types of place. And in particular, we wanted to consider areas emerging from the policy, again, that I'm not going to review here this morning. I'm going to focus on this study, but certainly Ken has raised some of those reports that have influenced this program, around issues emerging around shared and contested spaces, intergenerational relationships within spaces, safety and security, and the way in which public spaces are managed. I should also say that obviously during this talk I'm using the term space to refer to public locations and sites researched, and then using the term place for that social construction or representation of these spaces. I would also say that within the field of gerontology, there is a whole literature around the development of environments and aging. And that's particularly perhaps more focused on the interiors of people's ordinary housing, more institutional settings. But it's certainly true that we as a team were able to utilize that material to influence the work that we had on external spaces, and in particular issues around what's called environmental press. I was going to start by talking about some of the intergenerational issues that emerged from the research. Oh, here we are. Here we are. You've done it. It's certainly true that in the gerontology literature, there's a great emphasis on attachment to place, and people like to remain connected to public life, whether that's of village, town, cities, and that particularly applies to older people and those who don't have other connections through places of work, through education. The attachment to a place to which someone has been connected for a period of time becomes very important in discussions with people. And it's obviously true that when we think about issues of inclusion, public places that enable people of all ages to access essential services and facilities without particular barriers or safety concerns or transport difficulties are very important, and all of these things come together in what I'm saying. I mean, obviously though, we consider the facts I've just given you around what we know about people's health and well-being in later life, and that people do have physical impairments, and as you will know, the issues of visitability and accessibility are essential, and we're not going to have a discussion of the issues around the Disability Discrimination Act and the impact that that has had on planning issues, but that notion of taking account of those needs within our spaces is particularly important. At the same time, I want to comment on almost for us to hold these generational differences in our heads, because as Ken has raised too, younger people also have a particular need maybe to gather together in public spaces where issues of being sociable on what I've called a kind of neutral ground for gathering here is also important. So I don't see these things as tensions in opposition to each other, but they're things about understanding people's needs across the life course. And it's true that where many younger people gather together, such gatherings can produce unease and represents a source of disorder or petty crime. And it's certainly true that when you talk with adults in these same settings, they'll raise those issues about younger people and gathering and feeling threatened, even though they may not have any need to feel threatened, but those issues do occur. I mean, it's certainly true, and I'll say a bit about our methodology in a moment, that observation in this study showed that most of the time groups of young people are self-managing and benign. They're not a threat, in particular, to any of the older people who raised them in the street surveys that we also did as part of this study. And we certainly were suggesting in our report that rather than prohibiting gatherings of young people in public spaces, greater understanding of cultural issues between the generations could reduce feelings of threatening behaviour. And I should then say something about how we did our project, which was, we spent a whole year in Aylesbury. We involved members of the public as lay observers. It was a very participatory piece of research. And we had 46 members of the general public who we recruited through a whole wide range of sources, who worked, who were trained by the research team at the OU to do a form of non-participant observation where they worked in pairs, recording and observing particular sites across the town. We worked for 12 months. We worked from 7 in the morning till 1 in the next morning, and we kept a continuous cycle of observations up across the whole year from October 2004 to September 2005, because there are obviously real seasonal issues happening here. There are even issues that were drawn out of the observations around different age groups' use of space at different times of day. Older people tend to be in Aylesbury town as opposed to the residential, more suburban areas where we also observed early. They're there between 8 and midday. They're less likely to be there around 3:30, school outing time, or at the time when other people are going home. So there are patterns. Different people have different patterns to the day, and one of the really wonderful things by having all this observational data is to be able to see these patterns of everyday use of public space. So as you'll see from this, we did a lot of in-depth interviews. We did street surveys, which the academic team, and then we had the non-participant observation, which I have to say we weren't quite sure how it would go before we started this venture, except for the fact that the OU is, and our faculty are very keen on involving people in research if that's what they want to do. In this case, we did have these 46 volunteers who we trained at various points during the year, but many of those, at least half of those people, stayed with us across the whole period. Some people came in and did 2 or 3 months observation and then stopped. People were involved all the way through, right through to commenting on their observations and discussing ways in which we were interpreting the observations that were made. And of course, these were all people from Aylesbury. So in a sense, that also is an important fact, it seems to me. We had an advisory group for the project, which included our local planners and city centre managers, and in fact probably people very like yourselves, but I think they too were very felt the gaining information through members of the general public was an important part of the project. So I'll move on quickly and tell you something about some of the things we found. I leave this up just to show you how Aylesbury then sits against that earlier demography. It's a slightly younger town than those national figures that I showed you. So unfortunately this is census data from a few years earlier, but certainly you can see that the younger population slightly larger and the older population slightly smaller. It is a very white British population, 94% population white, the minority ethnic group within Aylesbury being predominantly of Asian origin, and having a particular residential area where the majority of Asian members were living. As you will have seen earlier, the 9 sites in which we were observing Aylesbury included not only the city, the centre of the city, but also park areas that were relatively central. There's a canal that goes through Aylesbury, and so the canal was also a site. And then there were 2 more suburban residential areas that we observed in. I think public spaces allow people to meet on ostensibly neutral ground in obviously planned and unplanned ways, and the interactions that we were observing included both family relationships that may be multi-generational shopping expeditions, certainly cultural groupings, in particular again, in relation to younger people. We observed, or our observers saw, local social connections, chance and planned or unplanned meetings with friends, as well as groups with meeting through common interest, and in particular that related to walking groups that were routinely seen along the canal walkway. But by facilitating this mix, public spaces can contribute to cohesion, it appeared to us. And this again goes back to Ken's boys about citizenship. There was little evidence of conflict, overt conflict, in the public spaces examined in this research. However, observations suggested that difference between groups can lead to self-segregation in the use of particular spaces, and that perceptions of difference and particular behaviours by different users can mean that spaces can be diverse as well as inclusive. I should say that the centre of Aylesbury has 2 squares. One's a market square, one's called Kingsbury. Kingsbury was subject to regeneration from 1909 and reopened as a new square in 2005 while we were observing, which was interesting in itself, and we hadn't planned this, but it was fortuitous that we were able to do this because it allowed us to do some things like talking to people in the street surveys about the consultation that was done about the regeneration of Kingsbury, and then to talk to people about 6 months on after it reopened. Now, again, my apologies for the lack of pictures which would have helped here, but Kingsbury Square has a cobbled surface, and it also had in its centre public conveniences which were underground, and both of these things went through regeneration. There were also a lot of flower beds in Kingsbury. These also went, and they have been replaced by a water feature which runs the whole length of the Kingsbury Square, very flat on the surface, with a timepiece at one end of it. Actually, artistically, a really interesting piece, but of course it only took a few days for the children to run sideways across the water feature, and the water became everywhere, and actually it's been switched off at the moment while it's being rethought slightly. The public conveniences, and I won't go on, I will go on about public conveniences actually, because you've only got to talk to older people about what is essential to them being in town square, and public conveniences are essential. This came up a lot in our stakeholders in interviews, the Cafe Society was supposed to accommodate for the lack of public conveniences, or it was felt by a number of our respondents, in that people would no longer have this more formal facility in the middle of the square, but informally they should be able to go and ask to use public conveniences. Now, come on, I won't say. Well, I could say that, but actually, in talking to the people in the street surveys that we did, I mean, that is a real issue. Many older people will plan their days knowing that they can go to the public convenience in a certain place. And it will prevent them, some people, from doing some things. So people were now having, in the main, they weren't going into any of the cafes on Kingsbury Square. There are cafes which eventually had seats out onto the paving area, but the weather wasn't always too kind to the outdoor seating, I must admit. So people were going into 2 shopping malls which were off the squares. Again, these were sites of our observations too. Really quite a long walk for some people, or into Sainsbury's, which also had a loo that people could use. So obviously people knew where the public conveniences were, and they didn't necessarily love the one that was in Kingsbury Square, which obviously had become, you know, it wasn't clean perhaps as often as it could be, and it was known for, you know, the drinkers who frequented that square before it started to be regenerated. So there were good things and bad things about it, but it was certainly an issue that came up a number of times. I should say something else about that, because I've just mentioned some of the drinking community of Aylesbury, and there are a number of homeless people who used to frequent the Kingsbury Square, and 8 of them, I think 8 was the majority we saw, moved themselves to Vale Park, which is the local public park. Sorry, I'll rant. I'll just end with this issue around the drinkers. Who moved themselves to the public park, and the public park certainly is also at least 10 to 15 minutes walk for someone like myself from the town centre. Very little signage that it exists at all. In fact, many of the people that we talked to didn't, you know, they knew it existed, but they couldn't really tell you how you got there, and it really wasn't that far away. So when we were doing our observations in the park, it was true that there we found this small group of people who'd used to frequent Kingsbury Square and who'd moved themselves into an area of formal gardens within the park, which was now avoided by a number of people. Except, interestingly, because the formal gardens were right next door to a bandstand, which was about 100 yards away, younger people who gathered after school, here we are, younger people who gathered after school in the bandstand, but at interestingly, at a distance. It was very... over time, it was very interesting to observe the fact that the small group of drinkers who'd moved themselves from the central square were having this was where they were always now during the course of nearly the whole day, and then after school, 3:30, 4 onwards, the bandstand about 100 yards away would become a place for youngsters to group together. Although interestingly, and it was interesting to observe not so much tension, but those issues of fear and security between the younger people's group and the drinking group, where actually once they got down to maybe 2 of them, they used to move. So people felt actually quite, I think, and I'm assuming, making some assumptions here, although we did do some discussions with youngsters in this group, of the security of this structure, the bandstand, but also the need for a number of people within the group alongside this other grouping. But certainly it had So, yes, we've mentioned that, and we have quite some interesting observations about the way in which people observe regulations around the public spaces in Aylesbury, which in the main they do observe, whether that's keeping a dog on a lead or not cycling through the park. And certainly I've mentioned some of those issues that certainly were raised by people of all age groups, but in particular older people within the street surveys, as well as from our analysis of the observations. Seats with support, I'll just say something about those. Benches that appeared everywhere over the town centre, and a number of people did talk to us about the need for backs to chairs, as well as things to lean on, and where certainly seats were in situations that were windy or not particularly a good sighting of street furniture, people used to just go and sit somewhere else, normally on walls. So again, public spaces also being seen to be used differently according to the degree of complexity of place that we were observing. We talked with people about the way in which focal points within places defined those places, and the need for being able to carry out activities and feeling secure. And I really want to end, because I know I've gone out, and perhaps this question actually also again perhaps relates to something that Ken was saying, but certainly this was really how we summed up our year-long observation of Aylesbury. That the question seemed to us, is it better to have spaces with people who are doing nothing than spaces that are doing nothing because there is no one present? And that seemed to sum up a lot of our observational work. And all I can say is that having done that period of observation for such a long period of time and supporting members of the public in doing that, I think we have almost data to be able to answer this question now. And perhaps I could have posed that question without that material and not felt so confident in being able to answer it. So I'm going to leave it there.